He was a man who never hesitated. In 30 years of running the most dangerous criminal empire on the East Coast, Adrian Voss had made decisions that ended careers, destroyed families, and buried men 6 feet deep without losing a single night of sleep. But on a rain-soaked highway in the dead of November, with floodwater swallowing his car and 2 women screaming his name, the man who feared nothing froze. And in that frozen moment, he made the one choice he could never take back. Stay with us until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since noon. Not the soft, forgettable kind that city people ignore from behind office windows. This was the brutal, unrelenting kind that bends trees sideways and turns drainage ditches into rivers. By 7 in the evening, the Weather Service had issued a flash flood warning for 3 counties along the Route 9 corridor. By 8, most of the secondary roads were already underwater. By 9:15, Adrian Voss was driving a $280,000 Bentley Mulsanne through a stretch of highway that had no business being navigated by anything short of a military transport vehicle, doing 80 miles an hour because Adrian Voss did not, as a personal and philosophical rule, slow down for anything. He had 2 women in that car. His wife, Elena Marlowe, sat in the rear left seat, 41 years old, 14 years of marriage, dark hair pulled back tight, the way she always wore it when she was somewhere she didn't want to be, which lately was everywhere he took her. She had her hands folded in her lap, fingers interlaced, the posture she'd developed over the last 3 years whenever she and Adrian were in the same enclosed space, controlled, careful, like a woman who had learned that small movements were safer than large ones. She was watching the rain hit the window without really seeing it. She had stopped trying to see things clearly a long time ago. Vanessa Cole sat in the rear right seat, 34 years old, 17 months of secrets. She had her phone face down on her thigh and her left knee bouncing in a rhythm that didn't match the music coming through the speakers, something low and orchestral that Adrian had selected and no one had been asked about. Vanessa was beautiful, the way expensive things are beautiful, deliberately, with effort, with a precision that required maintenance. She had the kind of face that made men stupid, and the kind of intelligence she'd learned to hide because intelligence made men nervous. Tonight she was nervous herself. She'd been nervous since Adrian had shown up at her apartment 2 hours ago and told her, without asking, that she was coming with them to the Hargrove estate for what he called a business dinner, and what she understood to be a statement. Adrian declaring in the oblique and plausibly deniable way that men like him communicated, that he was done compartmentalizing. Elena had said nothing when Vanessa got in the car. That silence was worse than anything she could have said. Adrian's hands were loose on the wheel. That was the thing about him that still disturbed people who spent time with him, even people who'd known him for years. His hands were always loose, on a steering wheel, on a table, wrapped around a glass of scotch, relaxed in a way that didn't read as calm but as something colder, something that suggested the tension other people carried in their hands had simply relocated somewhere interior and foundational, somewhere below the reach of expression. He was 53 years old, silver at the temples, black everywhere else, jaw like something carved rather than grown. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's car payments and had the sleeves pushed up to his forearms the way he always did, some habit from a younger version of himself that had never been shed. He was thinking about the Hargrove meeting, not about the women behind him, not about the rain, not about the road, which had narrowed to 2 lanes with a steep embankment dropping off the right shoulder toward what the maps called Carver Creek, but what the locals, in seasons like this one, called something considerably less polite. His phone rang through the car speakers. He answered it. "Talk," he said. It was Reyes, Marcus Reyes, his logistics man, the person who managed the movement of money and materials and people across the northern corridor of the operation. Reyes had a voice like gravel in a tin can and a disposition to match. "The Hargrove sit-down's been moved," Reyes said. "Dominic pushed it to Thursday. Says the weather's bad." "The weather's bad everywhere. His driveway flooded. Tell him to buy better drainage." "Adrian." A pause. The kind Reyes reserved for things he'd already decided to say, whether or not they were welcome. "The Hargrove thing can wait. Half the roads between here and the estate are closed. DPW's got barricades up past exit 14. How are you even— I know another way. Of course you do. Reyes let out a short breath. Damn. You've got people with you? Adrian's eyes moved to the rearview mirror for exactly 1 second. Long enough to see Elena's reflection, her gaze still on the window, her hands still folded, still. He didn't look at Vanessa. I'll call you Thursday, he said, and ended the call. The road curved left. He took it without reducing speed. Vanessa shifted in her seat. How much farther? 40 minutes, Adrian said. Elena said nothing. The silence that followed was the specific texture of a marriage in its final stages. Not explosive, not dramatic, but dense and pressurized, like something being compressed very slowly by weight it was never designed to hold. They had been in this silence for 2 years, though it had taken different forms at different times. Early on, it had been the silence of avoidance, of two people coordinating their orbits to minimize collision. Then it had been the silence of cold competence. They had functioned, had attended events and managed properties, and spoken to lawyers and accountants, and in some cases to the police with the fluid coordination of people who had spent enough time together that collaboration no longer required warmth. Now it was this. The silence of a thing that had already ended but hadn't yet been formally buried. Adrian had not intended for tonight to happen the way it was happening. He had told himself, on the drive to Vanessa's apartment, that he was simply solving a logistical problem. Vanessa had needed to be moved. There were people watching her building. He was handling it. He'd told himself this with the same flat conviction he applied to every decision, and it had worked for the 20 minutes it took to get to her door. And then it had stopped working the moment he walked into Elena's field of vision with Vanessa beside him, and Elena had looked at them both with those dark, still eyes and said nothing, not a single word, just adjusted her coat and walked to the car and got in. He should have found another solution. He knew that now, which was rare for him, knowing something in the moment rather than cataloging it for later examination. There was a quality to Elena's silence tonight that was different from the silence of the last 2 years. It wasn't cold, it was final. He pushed the thought down and concentrated on the road. The rain intensified. The wipers, at full speed, couldn't keep up. The headlights punched maybe 15 feet into the dark before the water swallowed them. The right shoulder disappeared entirely. He could see it one moment, and then it was simply gone, replaced by the glossy black surface of standing water that blended seamlessly with the road's edge. He dropped his speed to 60, then 55. The road looks wrong, Vanessa said. It's fine. There's water on the— I said it's fine, Vanessa. She went quiet. In the rear view, he saw Elena turn her head slightly, not toward him, but toward the window, toward the shoulder, and there was something in the movement that snagged his attention for a half second, something almost evaluative, like a person taking the measure of a situation they'd already calculated. He didn't understand what he was seeing. He wouldn't understand it until much later. The road dipped. It was a gentle depression, the kind you wouldn't notice in ordinary conditions, a natural low point in the terrain where the highway crossed a culvert. In dry weather, it was nothing. In weather like this, with Carver Creek running 3 feet above its bank, and the culvert backed up, and the runoff from the surrounding farmland all channeling toward this one low point in the road. In weather like this, it was a different thing entirely. Adrian saw the water a second before he hit it. Not a puddle. A sheet. A flow, dark and fast and at least 8 inches deep across the full width of both lanes, catching his headlights in a way that turned it briefly gold before the Bentley's front end drove into it at 52 miles per hour. The car did not stop. Bentley's weigh close to 6,000 pounds, and Adrian had not applied the brakes in time, and the physics of the situation were entirely indifferent to his personal authority. What happened was this. The front wheels lost traction simultaneously, the rear end came left, and Adrian corrected right on instinct, and the correction was too much, and the Bentley crossed the center line and then the opposite shoulder, and then, for a suspended and absolute moment, there was no road at all. The embankment on the left side dropped 10 feet to Carver Creek. The car went down it sideways. The impact when it hit the water was not the crash sound from films. It was a hollow, structural boom followed immediately by the sensation of violent deceleration and then the far more terrifying sensation of the car failing to stop. of it continuing to move, carried now by something outside the engine, outside the wheels, outside any system Adrian controlled. The water took them. The current was faster than it had looked from above. The Bentley's windows were already dark with it, and the car was already tilting, the right side beginning to drop as water found the path of least resistance and began its patient, indifferent work of filling every space it could reach. Adrian's head had hit the side window, not hard enough to knock him out, but hard enough to gray the edges of his vision for a few seconds. And in those seconds, the world reorganized itself into a new set of priorities that had nothing to do with Marcus Reyes or the Hargrove meeting or the careful architecture of the life he'd spent 30 years constructing. There was water coming in through the door seals. There was a sound from the rear seat that he would spend the rest of his life trying to classify. Not quite a scream, more like the specific quality of breath that comes from a person realizing all at once that they are in genuine danger, the exhalation that precedes whatever comes next. He turned. Both women were in the rear seat. The car was tilted at an angle now, right side down, and the physics of this meant that Elena, on the left, was elevated, braced against her door, which was above the waterline, while Vanessa, on the right, was lower, her feet already in water, her door pressed against the creek bed or the embankment, he couldn't tell which, sealed shut by pressure. "Get out," Adrian said. His voice was what it always was, flat, controlled, carrying the weight of a man unaccustomed to the concept of situations beyond his management. "Elena, your door—" "It won't open," Elena said. She was pulling at it with both hands. The frame had bent in the impact. He could see the misalignment even in the dark. "Vanessa!" He was already moving into the rear, climbing over the console, the car shifting under him as the current worked at it, rocking it in a slow and terrible way. "Vanessa, can you—" "I can't. The door—" Vanessa's voice was raw. She was pushing against her door, and it wasn't moving, and the water was at her knees now, and she turned her face toward him in the dark, and he saw what was in it. Not panic exactly, but something more specific, more particular. The look of a person who has suddenly understood that the person they've been relying on may not be what they believed. The car dropped another 6 inches. The right side, Vanessa's side, was almost fully submerged. He could feel the cold through the floorboards. Elena's door was jammed. Vanessa's door was sealed by pressure and depth. There was one way out. The rear window, which in the impact had developed a crack running corner to corner, stressed but not yet blown. Adrian grabbed the headrest from the front seat and drove it into the glass with everything he had. 2 impacts, 3, and on the third the window gave, collapsing outward, and the water that came in was a physical assault, a cold so sudden and comprehensive that it briefly erased every thought he had. But it also meant there was an opening. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the car went fully under. He looked left. He looked right. Elena was braced against her elevated door, water at her waist. Her face turned toward him with an expression he had never seen on her in 14 years. Not fear, but something that looked like clarity, like a woman who had arrived at a moment she had somehow, in some deep and private part of herself, been anticipating. Vanessa was to his right, submerged to her chest, both hands gripping the headrest in front of her, and she was looking at him with an expression that was pure and uncomplicated. It was terror, and it was his name, and it was the specific helplessness of someone who has placed their life in another person's hands without ever quite meaning to. Adrian Voss reached out. He had told himself in 30 years of making brutal decisions that he always knew why he did what he did, that he operated from calculation, not from instinct or sentiment or weakness, that every choice he made was a choice he could defend. He reached to the right. He pulled Vanessa toward the window. It took 40 seconds. It took every physical capacity he had, the current fighting him, the car shifting under him, Vanessa's weight and the water's resistance and the darkness and the cold that was past cold now and was simply pain distributed everywhere. He got her through the window. He got her to the surface. He got her to the embankment, where the creek shallowed to 4 feet over a gravel bed, and she grabbed at the roots of a tree that was still, barely, standing, and he heard her coughing and knew she was alive. He turned back. The Bentley was on its side, both rear windows underwater. The water above the car was dark and fast, and the only light was what filtered through from a half moon somewhere above the cloud cover, enough to see the surface, enough to see a hand. Elena's hand. It was above the water, pressed against the outside of what had been the upper window, the one that wasn't broken. And even as he watched it, it slipped. Not fast. Deliberately, almost. Like a person who had been holding on and had simply decided to let go. He went in. The cold hit him like a physical blow, like something structural giving way inside his chest. He went down, hands finding the car by feel more than sight, found the window, still intact, held by whatever remained of the seal, and pulled at it with everything left in his arms, and it was 12 seconds before the glass gave, and in those 12 seconds, Carver Creek made its displeasure fully known, pushing at him, pulling at him, working to carry him downstream with the same indifference it applied to logs and debris and anything else foolish enough to enter it tonight. The window gave. He reached in. His hands found fabric, her coat, her sleeve, and he pulled, and she came, or she let herself come. He would never be fully certain which, and they surfaced together in a confusion of water and darkness and his own screaming lungs, and he dragged her toward the embankment, toward the tree where Vanessa was still coughing, still holding, and he got Elena's hands onto the roots, and he got her to the gravel bank, and she was breathing, and then he sat in the shallows of Carver Creek in a $6,000 suit that was now simply wet fabric, and he could not move. Vanessa was on his left, Elena was on his right. Neither of them spoke. He sat between the two women whose lives he had just saved and whose lives he had been destroying simultaneously for 17 months, and the rain fell on all three of them without distinction, without preference, without any acknowledgement of the specific horror of what had just happened in that car. It was Vanessa who broke the silence first. She was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking, her arms wrapped around herself, mascara running black channels down her face, and she said, "You reached for me first." She didn't say it with triumph. She said it with a kind of sick wonder, as though she'd just witnessed something that disturbed her more than the crash itself. Adrian said nothing. Elena was sitting 2 feet to his right, her knees pulled to her chest, her wet hair loose from the braid it had been in, plastered to one side of her face. She was looking at the water, not at him, at the water. And she said very quietly, without inflection, without any of the heat that he would have expected, that he almost would have preferred, "I know." That was all. 2 words. And in those 2 words was everything. The 14 years, the patience, the erosion, the watching, the knowing, the enduring, and none of the surprise he had perhaps, in some protected corner of himself, been counting on. As though she had already performed the calculations. As though she had known the outcome before the river ever entered the equation. His phone was gone, carried off by the creek, or simply dead from the water. It took 40 minutes for a passing truck driver to spot them on the embankment and call for help. In those 40 minutes, the 3 of them sat in the rain on the gravel bank of Carver Creek, and no one spoke again. The silence had weight now. It had consequence. It was no longer the silence of avoidance or even the silence of a marriage's last stage. It was something newer and worse and more final, the silence that follows a decision that cannot be unmade. The paramedics came, the police came. The 3 news vans came before the ambulances had finished their work, because Adrian Voss's name was the kind of name that generated that response, and because crashes on flooded highways were slow night content, and because one of the first responders had apparently possessed a phone and minimal discretion. What the cameras captured, Adrian Voss, assisted to a waiting ambulance, one hand on Vanessa Cole's arm. Elena Marlowe, 14-year wife of the man the tabloids had spent years calling the East Coast's most powerful private crime broker, being loaded onto a separate stretcher with a hairline fracture in her left wrist and a hypothermia reading that the paramedics called serious. Adrian Voss, when the cameras reached him, looking not at his wife on the stretcher, but at the dark surface of Carver Creek as though the river still owed him something. What the cameras did not capture, the moment, just before the ambulances separated them, when Elena turned her head and found his eyes from across the distance, and looked at him with an expression that held none of the sorrow he deserved and all of the understanding she had no obligation to offer, and then looked away. He didn't know yet what that look meant. He would spend a very long time learning. In the hospital, the attending physician told him that Elena's core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels and that another 3 minutes in the water would have been a different conversation. He said this in the clinical, removed way of someone delivering information rather than judgment, and Adrian sat in the orange plastic chair in the waiting area with a blanket around his shoulders and a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and received this information and did not react, not visibly, not in any way that the nurse periodically checking on him could have recorded or reported. Inside, something was happening that he didn't have language for. Adrian Voss had built his entire life on the premise that he was a man of clear sight, that he saw situations accurately and acted on that accuracy without the distortion of emotion or sentiment. He had told himself this so many times and for so long that it had become architecture rather than belief, the structural material of his self-concept rather than a claim he continued to examine. Sitting in the plastic chair, wet through the blanket, coffee untouched, he understood for the first time that the clear sight had been the distortion. That the decisions he'd made with such conviction, including the one in the dark water 40 minutes ago, had never been made from clarity, but from something much less defensible, something much more human, and therefore much more costly. He had reached for Vanessa. He told himself it was proximity, instinct, the physics of the moment. He did not yet fully believe himself. Across the hospital, in a room with a warming blanket and an IV line and a police officer asking the standard questions about the accident, Elena Marlowe was very carefully, very quietly, beginning to understand that what had happened in the river was not a tragedy that had befallen her marriage. It was a revelation that had freed her from one. She answered the officer's questions in the measured, precise way she applied to everything. And when he was done and she was alone in the room with the beeping of the monitor and the blue-gray light from the corridor coming under the door, she stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she picked up the call button. Not to call a nurse. To hold something in her hand. To confirm that her hand still worked. That she was still here. That she had survived. Not just the water, not just tonight, but the longer and quieter drowning that had been her life for the last several years. In the morning, she would call her sister. She would ask for the number of a very specific attorney. She would begin, methodically and without drama, the process of extracting herself from everything that carried Adrian Voss's name. She did not know yet that he would come after her. She did not know yet what she was capable of doing to a man who had spent his entire life believing that he could not be brought down. She did not know yet that the woman who had sat silent in the back of a drowning car was the most dangerous thing in Adrian Voss's world. More dangerous than rivals, more dangerous than investigators, more dangerous than the 30 years of enemies he'd accumulated with such careless efficiency. She would learn, and so would he. Outside, the rain was finally letting up. Carver Creek was still running fast and brown and indifferent, carrying with it the pieces of things that had been swept in during the night. Branches, debris, the accumulation of a storm that had not cared at all about the lives it rearranged. Somewhere downstream, a piece of the Bentley's exterior trim caught on a sandbar and stopped moving. In the hospital parking lot, in a car with the engine running because she was still cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, Vanessa Cole sat with both hands on the wheel and stared at the entrance through which she'd walked an hour ago and thought about 4 words. You reached for me first. She had said it. She had meant it as, what, confirmation? Relief? She had spent 17 months telling herself things about Adrian Voss that she now understood, sitting in a running car in a hospital parking lot at 2 a.m, were simply the stories she'd needed to tell herself to keep doing what she was doing. She had told herself he was careful because he respected her privacy. She had told herself he kept her separate because he was protecting her. She had told herself that the way he looked at her, with that particular intensity that she'd read as desire, was different from the way he looked at everything he wanted to possess. In the river, with the water at her chest and his hands reaching for her, she had experienced 12 seconds of pure gratitude followed immediately by the most clarifying thought she had ever had. He did that because I'm easier to keep. She put the car in reverse. She didn't go back into the hospital. She didn't go to Adrian's room, or to Elena's room, or to the waiting area where she knew the remaining members of his security detail were assembled, doing the thing they always did, which was standing at readiness in case they were needed and trying to look invisible the rest of the time. She drove to her apartment. She sat in her parking garage for 10 minutes. Then she went upstairs and she poured herself 2 fingers of scotch from a bottle she'd bought because Adrian drank scotch, and she'd learned his preferences the way women in her position always learned them, as a kind of adaptive camouflage. And she sat on her couch in her wet clothes, and she drank it, and she thought about what came next. What she did not know, sitting there, was that someone had already been watching her building for 3 days. Not Adrian's people. Not anyone she could have anticipated. Someone with an entirely different set of interests in the network of relationships that Adrian Voss had spent 30 years constructing, and that was, as of tonight, beginning in small and very specific ways to come apart. By morning, the footage from the highway, dash cam, traffic camera, the truck driver's phone, would be in the hands of 3 separate journalists. By noon, the photograph would exist. Adrian Voss on the embankment, his hand on Vanessa Cole's arm, his wife on a separate stretcher in the background. Context-free. Devastating. By the following evening, the name Elena Marlowe would be spoken in rooms where it had never been spoken before. Rooms occupied by men who had spent years studying her husband, looking for the crack in his composure, the vulnerability that could be leveraged, the weakness in the architecture of a man who had presented himself as without weakness. They had found it, or rather, the river had found it for them. And in a warming bed in a hospital room with a monitoring cuff on her left arm and a hairline fracture in her wrist wrapped in a soft brace, Elena Marlowe lay with her eyes open in the blue-gray dark, and she was not yet thinking about those men or their rooms or the machinery that was about to be set in motion around her life. She was thinking about a highway in the rain, about a car going into a river, about the specific quality of cold water in the dark, and the way her husband's hands had found her coat with 6 seconds left before the car went fully under, and the way she had let herself be pulled. She was thinking about whether she would have made a different choice. She was thinking that she wasn't sure. And she was thinking, with the kind of cold, clear, quiet certainty that comes to people who have survived something that should have killed them and found on the other side of it that they are still exactly who they were, that it didn't matter, that the choice, whatever it had been, had already made itself, that what mattered now was not what had happened in the water, but what happened after it. She closed her eyes, her breathing steadied. 3 floors up, in a room with an adjoining bathroom and a window that looked out over the parking lot and the main road beyond it, Adrian Voss had not slept. He was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, in the dark, his hands loose on his knees, and he was listening to the rain. His phone had been replaced. One of his people had brought a new one within the hour, because Adrian Voss was not a man whose communications were allowed to go dark for long regardless of the circumstances. He had 7 missed calls from Marcus Reyes, 2 from his attorney, and 1 from a number he didn't recognize. He wasn't looking at any of them. He was looking at his hands, the hands that had pulled Vanessa through the window, the hands that had gone back in, the hands that had carried 14 years of marriage and 30 years of decisions and found, in the darkness of a flooded creek, that they had a hierarchy he'd never examined. Somewhere in the building beneath him, Elena was alive because he'd gone back. He told himself he needed her to understand that the going back mattered, that it changed the calculus of what had happened in the water, that it was evidence of something, loyalty, love, the durability of what they'd been, some quality in him that could be held up against the image of his hand reaching first for another woman. He sat in the dark, and he told himself this. And in the silence of the hospital room, with the rain finally slowing outside and the monitoring equipment down the hall providing its quiet, mechanical assurance that Elena Marlowe's vital signs remained stable. In that silence, for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, Adrian Voss was not sure he believed himself. He reached for the phone. He put it down. He reached for it again. He dialed Marcus Reyes. Reyes picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting. You alive? I'm alive. Elena? Alive. Fractured wrist. They're saying hypothermia. A pause. The news? I know. There are photographs, Adrian, from the embankment. They're going to... I know, Adrian said again. Another pause, longer this time, the kind Reyes reserved for things he was deciding whether to say. Then, Hargrove's people called. They're pulling out of Thursday. Adrian was quiet. Delgado's been making calls, Reyes said. I don't know what he knows yet, but he's He's moving fast. And there are 2 federal vehicles that have been parked outside the Meridian Street property since 6 this morning. Could be coincidence. It's not coincidence. No, Reyes agreed. It's not. Adrian looked at his hands again. Pull everything from Meridian Street. Tonight. It's 3 in the morning. Then people will be working late, Adrian said. And Marcus. Find out who took those photographs. He ended the call. He sat in the dark. Down the hall, somewhere beyond the range of whatever remaining authority he could project from a hospital bed in a wetsuit, his wife was breathing in the careful, considered way of a woman who had decided something. He did not know what she had decided. That in itself was new. In 30 years, he had always known what Elena was going to do before she did it. Had always been able to read her patience and her endurance and her quiet capacity for accommodation as constants, fixed points around which the rest of his life could safely orbit. She had never surprised him. He had understood this as steadiness. He had valued it the way you value a foundation, without thinking about it, without examining the assumption that it would simply continue to be there. He understood, sitting in the dark, that he had confused her endurance with permanence, that he had looked at a woman absorbing damage and seen stability rather than a limit being approached, that somewhere in the last 2 years, or the last 14, depending on where you chose to start counting, he had made a catastrophic error of category. Elena Marlowe had not been staying because she couldn't leave. She had been staying until she had everything she needed. He didn't know what that meant yet. He didn't know what she had been accumulating in the quiet, or what she had been learning, or who she had been talking to, or what conversations had happened in rooms he wasn't invited into. He was a man of intelligence networks, and he had deployed exactly none of them on his own wife because it had never occurred to him that he needed to, because he had confused her endurance with permanence. He got up from the bed. He walked to the window. The parking lot below was nearly empty, just his security vehicle and a nurse's sedan, and at the far edge of the lot, a dark car with its engine running. He watched the car for a moment. Then it pulled out and drove away, and he was left looking at his own reflection in the window glass. 53 years old, silver at the temples, jaw like something carved. And he looked at himself for a long time, the way a man looks when he's trying to determine whether the person looking back is still someone he recognizes. He wasn't sure. That was the thing that would keep him awake until morning, and many mornings after. He was no longer sure. The photograph ran in the morning edition of the Sentinel and 14 digital outlets before 6 a.m. It was not a complicated image. It didn't need to be. Adrian Voss, standing on a gravel embankment in a soaked suit, his right hand gripping the arm of a woman who was not his wife, while in the background, slightly out of focus but unmistakably present, a second woman was being lifted onto a stretcher. The caption read, "Voss Organization Head Survives Highway Flood. Wife Hospitalized." The caption did not mention Vanessa Cole by name. It didn't have to. By 7 a.m., 3 separate accounts had already done that work. Marcus Reyes saw it at 5:43 and called Adrian at 5:44. Adrian was already awake. He'd been awake since the window. "It's out," Reyes said. "I know. Your attorney is—" "Tell Hartman to stand down. No statements." "Adrian, this is—" "No statements," Adrian said. "Not yet." He put the phone down and looked at the photograph on the screen of the replacement phone someone had brought him at 3 a.m. He looked at it the way he looked at everything that required assessment, without expression, turning it in his mind, identifying the vectors of damage. The photograph itself was manageable. What was not manageable was what the photograph would do to the men and women who ran their operations adjacent to his, the people who had built their arrangements on the premise that Adrian Voss was a man of total control, control of his organization, his territory, his appetites, and above all his exposure. A photograph like this did not just damage a reputation, it raised a question. And the question it raised, what else doesn't he control, was the kind of question that in the world Adrian had built his life inside tended to get answered with aggression. He stood up. His ribs ached on the left side. He'd hit the console hard when the car went down the embankment and hadn't noticed until the adrenaline cleared sometime around 3. He breathed through it, the way he breathed through everything, steadily, without making it an event. And he got dressed in the clothes that had been brought to him, and he walked out of the hospital room and down the hall. He stopped at Elena's door. He stood outside it for a moment, The light under the door was pale and steady, not the shifting blue-gray of someone awake watching something, just the ambient light of a hospital room in the early morning. He put his hand flat on the door. He didn't know what the gesture meant. He wasn't a man who made gestures without meaning, which meant this one disturbed him. He took his hand off the door. He went downstairs. Reyes was in the lobby in a dark coat with his collar up, which was his version of trying to look inconspicuous, which meant he looked like a man trying to look inconspicuous. He was 50 years old and built like something load-bearing, and he had the face of a person who had seen enough of Adrian's decisions that very little surprised him anymore. But his jaw was tight this morning, in a way Adrian clocked immediately. "Walk," Adrian said. They walked out into the parking lot. The morning was gray and cold, the rain gone, but the air still wet with it, every surface carrying that particular gleam of exhausted precipitation. Adrian's breath came out visible. "Delgado made contact with Hargrove last night," Reyes said. "After midnight." Adrian kept walking. "I don't know what was said, but Hargrove's attorney called ours at 6 this morning and formally withdrew from the property arrangement." "Who else?" "Paulson's people are quiet, which means they're talking to each other instead of us. The Meridian Street crew got everything out by 4 a.m. I've confirmed that. But Adrian..." Reyes stopped walking. Adrian took 2 more steps and then stopped, because Reyes stopping was information. "There's something else." Adrian turned around. Reyes's jaw worked once. "Somebody got into the Corsair accounts. Not deep, not yet. They tripped a monitor flag, which means either they're amateurs or they wanted us to know they were there. Our security team is saying the access point was a credentials leak from 6 months ago, but the timing, someone's been waiting," Adrian said. "That's what it looks like." Adrian stood in the hospital parking lot and breathed the cold air and thought about the specific texture of an attack that had been planned rather than opportunistic. Someone had been holding a key and waiting for the right moment to put it in the lock, and the right moment had announced itself last night in the form of a photograph on 14 digital outlets. "Find out who," Adrian said. "Working on it." "Today, Marcus." "I understand, today." Adrian looked at the entrance to the hospital. Through the automatic doors, he could see the lobby, the desk, the corridor beyond. All of it indifferent to him, all of it simply continuing to be a hospital regardless of his presence. He thought about Elena on the floor above, in the room with the pale light, and he thought about the attorney she hadn't called yet but would, and he thought about the 14 years between them rendered as a single frame in a photograph neither of them had consented to. "I need to see her," he said. Reyes looked at him. "That's not..." "I know what it is," Adrian said. "I need to see her." He went back inside. He went back upstairs. The nurse at the station, not the same nurse from the night before. This was the morning shift. A heavy-set woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone who had watched enough family dynamics to have developed a comprehensive and uncharitable worldview, looked up when he approached. "Mrs. Marlowe's room," he said. "Mr. Voss." She said his name with the particular neutrality of someone who had read the morning news. "Mrs. Marlowe has asked not to be disturbed." Adrian looked at her. She looked back. "She asked specifically," the nurse said, "not to be disturbed." He stood at the desk for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked back to the elevator and stood in front of it with his hands in his pockets and waited for the doors to open. When they did, he got in. He pressed the lobby button. He stood in the elevator and watched the numbers change. In 30 years, there had been exactly 2 people who could close a door to him. One of them was in a room upstairs. The other had been his father, and his father had been dead for 21 years. He got out of the elevator. He sat in a chair in the lobby. He sat there for 40 minutes, not on his phone, not making calls, not doing any of the things that typically occupied every second of his waking life. He sat in a lobby chair, and he breathed, and he thought. At 8:45, Elena's sister arrived. Her name was Carol Marlowe. She'd kept the family name through 2 marriages and 1 divorce, which Adrian had always attributed to stubbornness and now thought might be better understood as a preference for things she could trust. She was 3 years older than Elena, shorter, with the same dark eyes and the same quality of stillness, and she walked through the lobby with a leather bag over one shoulder and a coffee carrier in her other hand, and she saw Adrian in the chair, and she stopped. He stood. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Don't." "Carol, I said don't." Her voice was quiet. Not theatrical, not built for an audience. Just the controlled delivery of a woman saying something she had decided to say, and wanted, said only once. "Whatever you're about to tell me, whatever explanation you've been working on since last night, don't." She walked past him. She went to the elevator. She pressed the button. "She's going to be fine," Adrian said to her back. "The doctor said—" "I know what the doctor said." The elevator opened. She stepped in. She turned and faced him from inside it with her coffee carrier and her leather bag, and her expression that was Elena's expression, made slightly less patient by 3 years of additional living. "She called me at 2 this morning. She told me everything." She paused. "Not just last night." The doors closed. Adrian stood in the lobby. Not just last night. He went outside. He stood on the concrete apron in front of the entrance. Reyes was across the parking lot in the vehicle with the engine running, on the phone, doing what Reyes always did, which was managing the multiple simultaneous problems that Adrian's decisions produced. One of his other men, Tate, a tall, quiet man from Baltimore who had been with Adrian for 8 years and who said approximately 12 words per day, was leaning against the passenger side of the vehicle with a coffee and the particular alert stillness of a person whose job was to notice things. Adrian's phone buzzed. He looked at it. The number he hadn't recognized the night before had called again. He picked up. "Mr. Voss?" A woman's voice. Measured, professional, the voice of someone making a call they'd made many times before. "My name is Sheila Park. I'm a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Division. I'd like to schedule a time to speak with you this week." Adrian was quiet for 3 seconds. "Call my attorney." "We've been in contact with Mr. Hartman," Park said. "This is a courtesy call, Mr. Voss, ahead of some developments that you'll likely be reading about in the next 24 hours. I thought you might appreciate the heads up." "I don't need courtesy from investigators." "You might need this one," she said. "There's a sealed filing that becomes unsealed on Thursday. It pertains to accounts connected to your name and to several properties in the Northern Corridor. We've been building this case for 14 months, and I want to be clear with you." A pause. Precise and intentional. "The cooperation window is not infinite." Adrian looked at the gray sky above the parking lot. "Call my attorney," he said again, and ended the call. He stood very still. 14 months. The same window as Vanessa. He thought about that, and then he stopped thinking about it because drawing that particular line of connection was not something he had the capacity to manage this morning. Not with his ribs aching and Carol Marlowe upstairs with her sister and the Corsair accounts flagged and Hargrove pulled out and Delgado moving fast. He called Hartman. Hartman answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been expecting the call. He was 70 years old and had been Adrian's attorney for 22 of them, and he had a voice like old wood. Dense, dry, nothing wasted. "I know," Hartman said before Adrian could speak. Thursday. And Adrian, the filing is significant. This isn't a fishing expedition. They have documentation." "From where?" A pause. "Some of it is what you'd expect, financial records, property transfers. But there's testimony, Adrian, cooperating witness testimony. Someone who had access to the interior structure." The interior structure. That was what Hartman called the organizational framework that lived below the legitimate business surface. The arrangements and agreements and understandings that kept things running and that Adrian had kept insulated, had kept separated from the surface by layers of abstraction and distance and carefully managed ignorance. Someone with access to the interior structure. "Who?" Adrian said. "I don't have the name yet. I'll have it by tonight. I need it now." "Adrian?" Hartman said his name the way he said it when he had something he was going to say that he'd prefer not to. "There are maybe 6 people living who have that level of access. You know who they are better than I do." Adrian knew who they were. He cycled through them, quickly, the way he processed information under pressure, not examining each one but feeling for the weight of the name, the quality of the history, the location of the stress points. He stopped on one. He didn't say it out loud. He ended the call. He walked to Reyes's vehicle. He got in the passenger side. Reyes, who had spent 20 years learning to read Adrian's silences with the precision of a translator, put his phone down and said nothing, and waited. "Nolan," Adrian said. Reyes went very still. Daniel Nolan had been with Adrian for 11 years. He ran the Northern Corridor Logistics, the same corridor mentioned in Sheila Park's 14 months timeline. He was 44 years old, methodical, self-contained, the kind of man you trusted because he seemed to have very few needs of his own, very little that could be leveraged. He had a daughter in college. He had a mother in a care facility in Providence. He had a salary from the legitimate side of the organization and arrangements from the other side that kept both of those things functioning. He also had, Adrian now recalled with the specific and nauseating clarity of information that had always been available but had never been assembled into its correct shape. A meeting 6 months ago with a man named Parrish who had connections to a law office that did work for the federal government. Adrian had known about the Parrish meeting. He had filed it without acting on it because Nolan had a credible explanation and because Adrian had wanted the explanation to be credible and had therefore allowed it to be. He had confused endurance with permanence. He had done it with Elena, and he had done it with Nolan, and he had done it in different ways for different reasons, and the result, in both cases, was that he had let a thing develop past the point where it could be cleanly addressed. "Find Nolan," Adrian said. "Don't call him. Find him in person and keep eyes on him until I say otherwise." Reyes nodded. He made a call. Adrian got out of the vehicle. He went back inside the hospital. He went back to the chair in the lobby. He sat in it, and he waited, because Elena was upstairs and Carol was with her. And there was nothing he could do about any of the things unraveling on every front, except wait for one of them to come within range of something he could actually control. He waited for 2 hours. At 11:15, Elena walked out of the elevator. She was dressed in the clothes she'd arrived in. Dried now, wrinkled, the coat that had been soaked pulled back on. Her hair was down, her left wrist was in a soft brace. She was moving at normal speed, which told him the doctors had cleared her for discharge, and Carol was 2 steps behind her with the leather bag over one shoulder and Elena's overnight bag. Someone had brought it, he didn't know who, Carol probably, over the other. Elena saw him when she was 10 feet away. She didn't stop walking. "Elena," he said. She stopped. Carol stopped behind her, and her expression was the expression of someone who has decided they will not intervene but will witness everything. Elena looked at him. Her face was clear of everything he would have expected: anger, grief, the specific theatrical sorrow of a betrayed spouse. She looked at him the way she had looked at the river last night, with that quality of seeing without sentiment, of assessment stripped of the weight of what she hoped to find. "Are you all right?" he said. It was not the thing he'd intended to say. He'd had something more structured, something that addressed the photograph and the night and the history, something with the shape of an explanation. What came out was that, "Yes," Elena said. A pause. "I need to—" he started. "I know what you need," she said. Not cruelly, not with the heat of someone who'd been up since 2 a.m. cataloging grievances. Quietly. The way she said everything, with the careful expenditure of someone who had learned long ago that words cost, and she had decided to spend them precisely. "You need me to hear your version of last night. You need me to understand the context. You need me to tell you that I know you came back." She paused. "I know you came back, Adrian." He said nothing. "That's not the question," she said. She started walking again. He moved to step in front of her, not aggressively, not the way he moved when he wanted to dominate a situation, but with the particular clumsiness of a man who doesn't know how to stop something through legitimate means. She stopped because she had chosen to, not because he'd made her. "Don't go somewhere I can't find you," he said. Something moved across her face, not the thing he'd hoped for, something closer to recognition, as though he'd confirmed something. "That's what you're worried about," she said, "that you won't be able to find me." "Elena, you have my number," she said. "Call it if there's something I need to know about." She walked around him. Carol passed him without looking at him. He stood in the lobby and watched them walk out through the automatic doors and get into Carol's car and drive away. And he stood there until the car was out of the parking lot and onto the main road. And then he stood there a little longer. His phone buzzed. Reyes. He answered. Nolan's not at his apartment, Reyes said. His car's there. His phone goes to voicemail. His neighbor said she saw him leave around midnight with a bag. Adrian closed his eyes for 1 second. His daughter's at school in New Hampshire, Reyes said. You want me to… No, Adrian said. Leave her out of it. Adrian, I said leave her out of it. He opened his eyes. He's already gone, which means the testimony is already given. He paused. Pull our people back from the Corsair properties. All of them. Today. A long silence. That's… Adrian, if we pull back from all of them at once, it sends a signal. People will know something's… People already know, Adrian said. Send the signal. He ended the call. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood in the lobby of the hospital where his wife had spent the night recovering from hypothermia, sustained in a flooded river into which he had driven while managing, in the rear seat, the 2-year collision between his marriage and his hubris. And he breathed, and he thought, and he understood that the day he was standing in the middle of was not the beginning of his unraveling. The unraveling had begun long before the river. The river had just been the moment when the thing that had been unraveling reached a length where it could no longer be mistaken for anything else. His empire had a crack in it. His marriage was walking toward Carol's car. His logistics chief was gone with a bag at midnight. A federal investigator was counting down to Thursday with the patience of someone who had already won. And somewhere in the city, in an apartment with the curtains probably still closed, Vanessa Cole was sitting with a decision she hadn't made yet, but was getting closer to making. He didn't know what that decision would be. He went outside. He got in Reyes's vehicle. Drive, he said. Reyes drove. They were 10 minutes from the hospital, on the highway that ran parallel to the Route 9 corridor, when Reyes said, quietly, without preamble, without the setup he usually gave difficult information, there's something else. Adrian looked at him. The journalist who broke the story this morning, the one who named Cole and ran the photograph. Reyes kept his eyes on the road. She's been contacted by someone inside the organization. Not Nolan. Someone else. She's been sitting on a second story for 3 weeks. About what? Reyes's hands adjusted on the wheel. One small movement, knuckles briefly pale. About Elena, he said. About things Elena has been doing for the past 18 months. Things she's been collecting. Adrian's body did something that had not happened to him in 30 years. His hands went cold, not from temperature, from a shift in his understanding that moved through him like a structural change, like the moment in a building when the settling sound changes from settling to something that means the building is deciding what it wants to do. Collecting, he said. Financial records, Reyes said. Internal communications. Testimony from people inside the organization. She's been… He stopped, chose the next word with the care of a man choosing where to step. She's been building something, Adrian. The highway moved past them. The gray morning light fell equally on everything. Adrian sat in the passenger seat of Reyes's vehicle and understood, with a completeness that permitted no revision, that Elena Marlowe had not been enduring. She had been preparing. And the woman he'd watched walk out of the hospital this morning, the woman he'd told not to go somewhere he couldn't find her, was already somewhere he couldn't find her, in a way that had nothing to do with geography. He had been so focused on what he'd done in the river that he hadn't understood what she'd been doing on the shore. The second story ran on Thursday, not the Sentinel this time. A longer publication, one with the kind of institutional weight that meant the lawyers had read it 3 times before it went to print and had decided it could survive what came after. The headline was measured, deliberately, professionally measured, the way headlines are written when the content beneath them does not require amplification. Voss Organization. 18 months of internal documentation reveals systemic financial fraud across Northern Corridor properties. Beneath it, a byline Adrian didn't recognize. Beneath that, a photograph he did. Not of the embankment, not of him and Vanessa, but of a building on Meridian Street, taken in daylight, with a caption that listed the registered owner and 3 shell entities connected to it by a chain of documentation that had apparently been assembled with considerable care over a considerable amount of time. Adrian read it at 6:47 a.m., at the desk in the office of the house on Calloway Street, which was the property he used when he needed to be somewhere that wasn't his primary residence and wasn't any of the organizational properties. A house that technically belonged to a holding company that technically belonged to a trust that was several layers of abstraction removed from his name. He had moved there the morning after the hospital. He had not gone back to the primary residence because the primary residence was where Elena had been living for 14 years, and Elena was no longer there, and standing in rooms shaped by her absence was not something he was prepared to do while simultaneously managing the controlled demolition of everything else. He read the article twice. Then he read it a third time, more slowly, the way he read things when he was looking for the specific rather than the general, looking for what the writer knew versus what the writer had been told, looking for the texture of the sourcing, looking for the shape of what Elena had built, because it was Elena's work. He knew that by the second paragraph, not because her name was anywhere in it. It wasn't. She was not identified. The sourcing was attributed to documents and unnamed individuals with direct knowledge, but because of the architecture, the way the information was organized, the sequence in which the properties were addressed, the specific financial instruments identified, the timeline constructed, it had the quality of something assembled by a person who understood not just what the information meant, but how it would be received, how it would be used, what sequence would produce maximum structural damage rather than maximum immediate noise. Elena had always been smarter than people gave her credit for. Adrian had given her credit for it, privately, in the way that he privately acknowledged things he didn't examine openly. He had valued her intelligence as an asset, her ability to manage the social surface of their life, to navigate the rooms where his business required a certain kind of presentation, to understand without being told what needed to be understood. He had valued it the way you value a tool, for its function, not for what it implied about the tool's own capacity for independent purpose. He put the phone face down on the desk. He sat very still for 30 seconds. Then he picked the phone back up and called Hartman. Hartman answered and said before Adrian could speak, "I've read it." "The cooperating witness," Adrian said. "It's not Nolan." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to confirm what Adrian already knew. "No," Hartman said. "It's not Nolan." "The filing that unsealed this morning?" "Yes." "Her name is on it." "Yes, Adrian, her name is on it." Hartman's voice had the quality of a man delivering information he had known was coming for long enough that the delivery itself had become a kind of maintenance task. Necessary, unpleasant, the thing you do because the alternative is worse. Elena filed as a cooperating witness 14 months ago. The documentation she provided constitutes the primary evidentiary basis for the federal case. Nolan's cooperation is supplementary. He stopped, resumed. "She was the architecture, Adrian. Adrian. Nolan was a brick." Adrian said nothing. "The immunity agreement is comprehensive," Hartman continued. "She has full protection. Anything connected to her name or her activities during the marriage is covered. They gave her everything she asked for, because what she gave them was worth everything she asked for." "Yes." Adrian stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. The street outside was ordinary and indifferent. A Tuesday morning on Calloway Street, a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck idling at the corner, the completely mundane infrastructure of a city that did not care at all what was happening inside the house he was standing in. "When?" he said. "When did she make contact?" Another pause. 16 months ago. 2 months before she would have had any reason to know about Vanessa Cole. Hartman said this carefully, with the precision of a man who understood that the sequence mattered enormously. "She didn't do this because of the affair, Adrian. She did this before she knew about the affair." Adrian processed this. It took longer than most things took him to process, because it required a fundamental reorganization of the story he had been telling himself, which was, he understood only now, the story that had structured everything, the load-bearing narrative, that Elena had been wronged, that the wronging had a specific origin point he could identify, that the damage had a cause he could, in some theoretical future, address. She had not started building her case because of Vanessa. She had started building it because of him, because of what he was. Because of some assessment she had made 16 months ago or earlier, he would never know exactly when she had begun watching, only when she had acted, about what kind of man she had spent 14 years beside, and what it would cost her to stay, and what she was going to need to leave. He had thought she was enduring. She had been deciding. "I need a location," Adrian said. "I can't help you with that." "Hartman, I am your attorney," Hartman said, with the flat precision of a man drawing a line he has thought about for some time. "I am not your intelligence service. And I will tell you directly, Adrian, as your attorney, that any attempt to locate or contact Elena at this point would be counterproductive. Does not begin to cover it. She has federal protection. If you... I understand the situation." "I don't think you do," Hartman said. "Not fully. Not yet." Another pause. "There's a grand jury convened for Monday. The sealed filing this morning was the last procedural step before formal charges. You have between now and Monday to make decisions about how you want to position yourself for what comes after. I need you in my office today." "This afternoon," Adrian said. "This morning, Adrian." He ended the call. He stood at the window. Reyes was in the kitchen. He heard him moving, the sound of a coffee maker, the specific domestic ordinariness of a man who had been awake since 4 a.m., managing multiple problems, and had decided that coffee was within his jurisdiction even if everything else was not. Adrian walked out of the office and into the kitchen, and Reyes looked at him and handed him a cup without being asked. "She was the primary witness," Adrian said. Reyes's face did something careful. "I know. How long have you known?" "Since last night," Reyes said. "I got a name from someone in the filing office. I didn't..." He stopped, set his own cup down. "I didn't know how to tell you." "You tell me by telling me," Adrian said. "That's how it's always worked." "I know." Reyes looked at the counter. "I'm sorry." Adrian drank his coffee. "Don't be sorry. Tell me what else you know." The documentation she provided covers the Northern Corridor properties, the Corsair accounts, the arrangement with the Port Authority from 2019, and the Delgado Commission structure from 2021. Reyes recited this with the flatness of a man reading from something he'd memorized because he needed his hands free. "They have internal communications, emails, they have some recorded calls. I don't know how she accessed the recorded calls." Adrian did. He thought about it for exactly 2 seconds, and then he knew. There was a device on the secondary phone he kept at the primary residence, the phone he used for organizational calls when he was home, because his primary personal phone was sometimes in the car, sometimes in his jacket, sometimes in rooms where he didn't want it. The secondary phone lived in the drawer of the desk in the study. He had never thought about what happened to that phone when he wasn't using it. He had never thought about the fact that Elena was in that house every day, had access to every room, had 14 years of accumulated knowledge about his habits and his schedules and the exact predictability of a man who had never, not once, considered his wife a threat. He put his cup down. "I need a car," he said. "Alone." "Adrian." "Alone, Marcus." Reyes looked at him for a moment. Then he took a key from his pocket and put it on the counter. "It's the gray sedan in the back," he said. "It's clean, not connected to anything." Adrian took the key. He drove to the primary residence. He used his key to get in through the side entrance, which habit and an old installation of locks meant was quieter than the front. The house was empty. He'd known it would be empty. Elena's absence was a confirmed fact, not a hope. But empty felt different than he'd expected. Not the absence of a person, but the absence of an organizing principle. The rooms were the same rooms. The furniture was the same furniture. The light that came through the east-facing windows was the same light that had come through those windows every morning for 11 years. But something had been removed from the equation that he hadn't understood was load-bearing until it was gone. He went to the study. He opened the drawer. The secondary phone was there. He picked it up and turned it over and found, on the underside of the battery panel, which on this model required a thumbnail and slight pressure to remove, a device approximately the size of a fingernail. Matte black. Unremarkable. The kind of thing available to anyone with sufficient motivation and a competent contact, which described Elena's situation accurately in both dimensions. He held it in his palm. He thought about all the calls he'd made from this phone, all the conversations. The Delgado Commission structure, yes, he remembered that call. A Sunday evening. Elena had been somewhere in the house. He'd heard her in the kitchen. He'd made the call from the study with the door closed because closing the door was the habit, not because he was worried about being overheard. The 2019 Port Authority arrangement. The Corsair account instructions. 16 months of calls that he had made in the apparent privacy of a closed door in his own study, and every one of them had gone somewhere else. He put the device on the desk. He sat in the chair behind the desk, the chair he'd sat in for 11 years, making calls and reviewing documents and running the organizational architecture that Elena had spent the last 16 months systematically disassembling. And he put his elbows on the desk and his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a while, not breaking. He was not the kind of man who broke, or if he was, he had never been presented with the specific combination of pressures that would locate that threshold, and he was not locating it now. But there was something happening that was adjacent to breaking, a compression, a structural event, the feeling of something very large settling into a new configuration under its own weight. He had built 30 years. He had built it with a specific set of assumptions about who was inside his perimeter and who was outside it, who could damage him and who could not, who he needed to watch and who he could afford to disregard. He had been precise about enemies. He had been thorough about threats. He had constructed, with genuine intelligence and genuine effort, and a level of operational discipline that had kept him operating when lesser organizations had collapsed, a world in which he understood the vectors of danger. He had not understood that the most comprehensive threat he would ever face was sleeping in the room down the hall from his study, not because she was malicious. That was the part that sat in his chest like something swallowed wrong. Elena Marlowe was not a malicious person. He knew her. 14 years was enough to know a person, or he had believed it was. And what he knew was that she was not cruel, was not vindictive, was not operating from a desire to destroy him. She was operating from a decision she had made about what she deserved, and about what continuing to be Adrian Voss's wife was costing her, and about what she was going to have to do to get out of it in a way that left her intact. She had done what she needed to do. She had been thorough and patient and precise, which were things he had always valued in people, and she had applied them to him, and he had not seen it because he had not looked. His phone rang. Not Hartman, not Reyes. The number was one he recognized after a moment as belonging to a man named Gerald Cross, who occupied a specific and important position in the organizational structure. Not inside the operation itself, but adjacent to it, in the particular space occupied by people who provided services to the operation while maintaining enough separation to be genuinely deniable. Cross had a legitimate business. He also had a relationship with Adrian that had been productive and professionally cordial, and that Adrian had always understood to be built on the foundation of Cross's rational self-interest. He answered. "I need to see you," Cross said. His voice had a quality Adrian hadn't heard in it before. Not panic, but its professional cousin. Urgency stripped of every non-essential element. The voice of a man who has identified a problem and is moving directly toward its management. When? Now, an hour. The place on Fenwick. The place on Fenwick was a restaurant that Cross owned, legitimately, properly, with a liquor license and a health inspection rating and a Thursday lunch special. They had met there before, always in the back room, always with enough ambient noise that conversation was private without requiring the awkwardness of devices and sweeps. 1 hour, Adrian said. He left the house. He left the device on the desk. He left the secondary phone in the drawer where it had always been, because removing it now served nothing except to confirm that he had found it. He drove to Fenwick. Cross was already in the back room when he arrived. 57 years old, heavy-set, with a face that was professionally pleasant in the way of men who have made a living from being liked and had long since lost track of where the performance ended. He was not performing pleasantness today. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table and his untouched coffee in front of him, and an expression that Adrian classified upon entry as something between shame and calculation. The expression of a man who has decided to do something difficult and is managing his own reluctance. Adrian sat down. Cross said, "Delgado came to see me." When? Yesterday morning. Before the article ran, he knew it was coming. He knew the content. Cross's hands pressed flatter on the table. He's been talking to your people, Adrian. Not the outer people. The people who would know what was in those properties. People who would know the structure. He found Nolan. Before you did, Cross said. 2 weeks before. He looked at Adrian directly, which was something he usually avoided not out of disrespect but out of the practical wisdom of a man who had learned that direct eye contact with Adrian Voss required a specific preparation. He has the Thursday filing, not the public version, the full version with the testimony appendix and the exhibit list. Someone inside the federal office gave it to him. Adrian sat with this. Someone inside the federal office. That was a different category of problem. Not just Nolan's cooperation, not just Elena's documentation. Someone with access to the federal case had provided its contents to Delgado, which meant Delgado was not positioning himself as a competitor, taking advantage of Adrian's exposure. He was positioning himself as a participant in the process that was creating it. What does he want? Adrian said. Cross looked at his coffee. He wants the Corsair properties, all of them, and the port arrangement. That's everything in the northern corridor. Yes. He wants me to hand him my entire northern operation. Yes, Cross said, and he wants it done before Monday, before the grand jury. He paused. In exchange for, he says he has the capacity to create significant procedural difficulties for the federal case. He says the testimony can be challenged. He has, Cross stopped. Then, he says he has information about the cooperating witness that he believes would disqualify her testimony under the immunity agreement. Adrian looked at him. About Elena, Cross said. He says he has something about Elena, something that would... He said if her immunity is challenged successfully, the primary evidentiary basis collapses and the case loses its architecture. Cross met his eyes again. He said to tell you that specifically, that it loses its architecture. The word hit Adrian in a specific and precise way because it was not a word Delgado would choose. Delgado spoke in the blunt, functional vocabulary of a man who had spent his life doing physical work on difficult problems. Architecture was Elena's word. It was what Hartman had called her contribution to the federal case. It was not a coincidence. He's talked to her, Adrian said. Cross went very still. Delgado has made contact with Elena, Adrian said. Not a question. Cross picked up his coffee cup, put it down without drinking. I don't know that. Gerald? I don't know it for a fact, Cross said. What I know is that the word he used was not a word he had any reason to use, and that he told me she was the architecture before I told him what Hartman had told you. I don't know what that means. Adrian knew what it meant. It meant that Elena's exit from their marriage, her 16 months of careful preparation, her meticulous dismantling of his organizational infrastructure through properly insulated federal cooperation, none of that had happened in isolation. She had been visible, in her methodical, careful way, to people who paid attention to such things. And Delgado paid attention to such things. It meant that Elena was no longer only inside the federal case. She was also inside Delgado's calculation, which meant she was in danger of a different and more immediate kind than the organized legal demolition she had set in motion. The kind of danger that did not care about immunity agreements and did not operate through grand juries and did not require documentation or procedure. Adrian stood up. Cross looked up at him. What do I tell him? Tell him I'll have an answer by Friday, Adrian said. He said no extensions. Tell him Friday, Adrian said. His voice was what it always was. Flat, without temperature, carrying the specific weight of a man who has not yet decided what he's going to do, but has decided absolutely that no one else is going to determine the timeline. And Gerald, Cross looked at him. Don't speak to him again until I say so. He walked out of the back room, through the restaurant, past the tables being set for lunch, past the bartender doing his morning inventory, out through the front door and into the cold of a Thursday morning on Fenwick Street. He stood on the sidewalk. He had come into this morning understanding that his empire was fractured, his marriage was over. His key logistics man had cooperated with federal investigators. His wife had done the same more comprehensively, and that charges were coming on Monday. He was leaving this morning with all of that still true and one additional piece of information layered on top of it, that Delgado, who was not a subtle man in most respects but was a thorough one, had somehow made contact with Elena, and that Elena, who was careful and intelligent and who had spent 16 months building a legal fortress around herself, was perhaps not as safely inside that fortress as she believed. He called Reyes. "I need to find Elena," he said. "Not to approach her. Not to... I need to know where she is." "Adrian, she's in danger," he said. "Not from me, from Delgado. He's made contact and she doesn't know what that means yet." He paused. "She's been operating like this is a legal problem. Delgado doesn't do legal problems." A silence. Then Reyes said, "Carol, her sister. Carol's phone will be monitored by the federal case team. Any contact through Carol is visible." "Then we need someone Carol doesn't know," Reyes said. "Someone who can find where she's staying without flagging anything connected to us." He paused. "This is going to take time we might not have." "Start now," Adrian said. He stood on Fenwick Street and he thought about Elena in a room somewhere, methodical and prepared and protected by an immunity agreement and a federal case and 16 months of careful work. And he thought about what she did not know, which was that the man who had pulled her out of a flooded river was not the most dangerous thing currently oriented in her direction. He had spent 30 years as the most dangerous thing in most situations. He understood. Standing on a cold sidewalk outside a restaurant on Fenwick Street, with a grand jury scheduled for Monday and a territorial rival in possession of information that should not have been possible to possess, that the only resource he had left that mattered was not his organization, which was fractured, or his attorney, who was managing, not protecting, or his money, which was increasingly visible in ways that made it a liability rather than an asset. The only resource he had left was himself. And to use himself effectively, to do the one thing that might matter, which was to get between Elena and whatever Delgado had set in motion before it reached her, he was going to have to become something he had not been in 30 years. He was going to have to ask for help. Not direct it, not purchase it, not command it from a position of organizational authority that no longer existed in any functional sense. He was going to have to stand in front of people and say, "I need this, and I have nothing to offer you except the fact that it's the right thing to do." And he was going to have to mean it, and meaning it was going to require him to locate, in whatever remained of himself after 30 years of accumulation, something that had been present before the accumulation began. He didn't know if it was still there. He started walking. He walked 3 blocks before he took his phone out and dialed a number he had not dialed in 11 years. A number he had memorized. When memorizing, it still felt like it mattered and had never deleted because he had never been able to identify a version of himself that could do that. It rang 4 times. A woman's voice answered. Not Carol, someone younger, slightly uncertain. The voice of a person answering an unknown number with the wariness of someone who had learned to be wary. "My name is Adrian Voss," he said. "I need to speak with your mother. Tell her it's about her sister. Tell her..." He stopped, breathed, said the thing that cost the most. "Tell her I think Elena is in trouble, and I'm the only one who knows how much." Carol's daughter was named Sophie, and she was 23 years old, and she had inherited her mother's eyes and her aunt's stillness, and she said, after a silence that lasted long enough to tell him she was deciding rather than simply reacting, "Don't move. I'm calling my mom." He stood on the sidewalk on Fenwick Street and waited. It took 4 minutes. He counted them by the movement of traffic, by the rhythm of his own breathing, by the specific quality of cold air entering his lungs and leaving again, which was the one process in his life that was still operating without complication. Carol called from a different number. She didn't say hello. "Talk," she said, which was his word, which Elena had apparently shared with her sister, or her sister had heard it from someone, or it was simply what the situation required. "Delgado knows where Elena is," Adrian said, "or he's finding out. He has someone inside the federal case, not deep, but deep enough to access the testimony appendix, which means he has her statement, and he has enough context to identify where she's been cooperating from. He's not going to challenge her testimony in court, Carol. He told Cross he would, but that's not his method. His method is to remove the problem." A silence. "He told you this." "He told Cross. Cross told me. Delgado wants the northern properties by Friday, and he's using the threat of challenging her immunity as leverage, but the leverage is theater. What's real is that she's visible to him now, and she doesn't know it." "Why are you telling me?" It was the question he had been expecting. It was also the question he had no clean answer to, nothing that could be packaged as strategy or calculation or the rational self-interest that had governed every decision he'd made for 30 years. He stood on Fenwick Street and he said the only true thing, because I can't get to her without you. And because whatever she's built against me, whatever happens Monday, none of that matters if Delgado reaches her first. Another silence. Longer. Where are you? Carol said. He gave her the address of the Calloway Street house. She hung up without confirming she was coming. He walked back to the gray sedan and drove to Calloway Street and sat in the kitchen with Reyes and drank bad coffee and waited. And at 12:47 p.m., a car he didn't recognize pulled into the back alley, and Carol Marlowe got out of it alone. She came through the back door that Reyes had left unlocked, as instructed. She stood in the kitchen in a coat that was still cold from the outside, and she looked at Adrian across the width of the kitchen island, and she said, "She's at my house." Adrian looked at her. "She's been at my house since the morning she left the hospital," Carol said. She didn't want a hotel because hotels have records, and she didn't want an Airbnb because she didn't trust the verification systems. She's been in my guest room for 3 days working on her laptop and eating whatever I put in front of her and sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. She paused. She told me not to tell you. I know. I'm telling you anyway. Carol's jaw tightened. Not because I forgive you, not because I think what you did to her is something that gets fixed. I'm telling you because she is my sister, and if what you're saying about Delgado is accurate, it is. Then I'm going to need you to do exactly what I tell you, Carol said, and not make a single decision without running it through me first. Because Elena is going to see you, and she is going to want you gone, and you are going to have to stand there and take that and not do the thing you always do. What do I always do? Carol looked at him with the expression of a woman who had watched her sister for 14 years from the outside of a marriage and had therefore seen things the people inside it couldn't. You manage, she said. You turn every situation into something you're running. You don't do that today. Today you show up and you tell her what you told me and then you stand back. He nodded. I mean it, Adrian. I know you mean it, he said. Let's go. Carol's house was 20 minutes away, a narrow 2-story on a tree-lined street in the kind of neighborhood that had been working class 30 years ago and was now expensive in the quiet way of places that hadn't tried to be. She pulled into the driveway. Adrian parked on the street. He sat in the gray sedan for a moment with his hands on the wheel, and he did a thing he almost never did, which was locate the exact texture of what he was feeling before he walked into a situation, because knowing the texture helped him manage it. What he was feeling was not fear. It was something below fear, something more structural. The specific vertigo of a man who has spent 30 years knowing where he stood and who is now genuinely unable to locate that ground. He got out of the car. He followed Carol up the front steps. She used her key. She pushed the door open and stepped inside and said, in the direction of the stairs, Elena, come down. A pause, then footsteps, even, unhurried. Elena appeared at the top of the stairs in a sweater he didn't recognize, Carol's probably, and dark trousers and no shoes, and she was carrying her phone in one hand and a pen in the other, the specific combination of a person who had been working, and she looked down at Carol first, and then her eyes moved to Adrian, and she stopped. Something happened in her face. He had known her face for 14 years, and he watched it go through 4 things in 2 seconds. Recognition, assessment, something that was not quite anger but adjacent to it, and then the stillness, the particular stillness she wore when she had decided what she was doing. No, she said. Elena, Carol started. No. She was looking at Adrian. Whatever this is, Delgado, Adrian said. Her face changed on the word. Fractionally. A small tightening around the eyes that was not quite surprise. He knows where you are, Adrian said. Or he's close to knowing. He has someone inside the federal case, and he has your testimony appendix, and he has enough to find you, and he is not, Elena, he is not going to challenge your immunity in court. That's not what he does. She came down 3 steps, stopped. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at the river, without sentiment, with that quality of clear assessment. How do you know this? She said. Cross. Cross is Delgado's contact point for the approach, she said. Cross told you because Delgado wanted you to know. He's using me to move you. Adrian went still. He had not considered this. He ran it in 3 seconds. Delgado's approach. Cross is the intermediary. The specific information Cross had delivered, the word architecture, and he understood with the sick and specific clarity of a man who has just discovered he has been running in the direction of something rather than away from it, that Elena was right. Or that she might be right. That Delgado was sophisticated enough to use Adrian's protective instinct, a thing he'd never previously had reason to account for as a variable in Adrian's behavior, as a lever to produce movement. Get Adrian running toward Elena and follow Adrian to Elena. You knew, he said. I suspected, she said. When he made contact with me, he made contact with you directly. 3 days ago. Her voice was level. A man came to Carroll's street. He didn't knock. He just stood outside long enough for me to see him from the window. It was a message. You didn't go to the federal case team. I did, she said. Immediately. They're aware. They moved a vehicle to Carroll's street within 2 hours. She paused. There's an agent parked outside right now. There has been since Tuesday. Adrian turned and looked back through the front window. Down the street, a gray SUV he had dismissed as neighborhood traffic. Sitting there. Engine off, which meant it had been there for a while. You've been managing this for 3 days, he said. Yes. Without telling me. Something moved across her face. Not triumph, not sorrow, but something in the register of a person recalibrating the terms of a conversation. You are not someone I manage things with anymore, Adrian, she said. You are someone I manage things around. He absorbed this. Carol from the hallway said, Adrian. He turned. Carol was looking at her phone. Her face had gone a color that had nothing to do with the temperature. The agent outside, she said. I just got a notification from the security camera on the garage. The SUV left. She looked up. 4 minutes ago. The 3 of them stood in Carol's front hallway and processed this. Adrian processed it faster than the other 2 because he had 30 years of experience with the specific implication of a protective presence withdrawing without explanation, and what it implied was not that the threat had passed. It implied the opposite. Back door, he said. Now. Elena looked at him. I'm not moving you for Delgado, he said. The SUV leaving is either a recall or it's been removed. Either way, you're not standing in a house where someone was watching to confirm your location 3 days ago. He looked at Carol. Is there a car in the garage? My husband's. He's at work. Keys. Carol went for them. Adrian took Elena's arm. She let him, which he registered as information, a small data point about the current state of a very complicated relationship, and moved her toward the back of the house. The kitchen, the back door, the garage. Carol appeared with keys. Adrian took them. He opened the garage door from inside, not the automatic, the manual release, quieter, and checked the alley. Clear. He got Elena into the passenger side and Carol into the rear, and he backed out of the garage with the lights off and drove the alley to the cross street and turned east. His phone rang. Reyes. There are 2 vehicles that have been moving parallel to your route since Fenwick Street, Reyes said without preamble. I've had Tate on a bike since noon. They've been hanging back, but they're tracking you. Delgado's. Has to be. Not Federal? Federal doesn't use that formation. A pause. They're going to know you're in the car with her. I know. So the play of moving her is, I know, Marcus. He turned right, checked the mirror. Nothing visible, which meant nothing. Where's Tate now? Behind the second vehicle, about 4 cars back. Can he get in front of the lead vehicle? A pause while Reyes relayed this. He says yes. Tell him to get in front and slow down. I need 2 minutes of stopped traffic on Clement Avenue. That's, tell him. He drove. Elena sat beside him without speaking, her hands in her lap, the pen she'd been carrying when she came down the stairs still in her right hand, which told him she'd been moving too fast to put it down and had held on to it because letting go of it was a decision that required attention she was spending elsewhere. He noticed this. He didn't say anything about it, Carol said from the back seat, in a voice that was controlled in the specific way of someone controlling it through effort. Where are we going? Hartman's office, Adrian said. It's downtown, it's legitimate, it's on record. Any action taken against a vehicle pulling into the parking structure of a federal attorney's office building is an action Delgado cannot explain. You want to use your attorney as cover, Carol said. I want to put Elena somewhere that has more protection than a residential street with an absent federal vehicle, Adrian said. Yes. Elena spoke for the first time since the garage. She was looking at the side mirror. The blue sedan, she said, 3 cars back. It was on Carroll Street this morning. He'd already seen it. I know. There's another one, she said, black, further back. I can just see it when the road straightens. He looked at her. How do you know there's another one? Because Delgado sent 2 to the street on Tuesday, she said, as though this were obvious, as though she had been studying Delgado's operational patterns, as though the woman who had spent 16 months systematically dismantling his financial empire had also, in the last 3 days, been studying the man currently trying to use her as a pressure point, which, Adrian understood, she had. What else do you know about his formation? He said. Elena looked at him. It was the first time since the stairs that she had looked at him directly, without the mediation of distance or the cover of assessment. She looked at him the way you look at something that has shifted unexpectedly, not with trust, not with the warmth of a renewed alliance, but with the sharp, alert attention of a person who has detected movement in a thing they had calculated as stationary. He uses a lead vehicle as visual confirmation and a trail vehicle for physical interdiction, she said. The trail vehicle hangs back until the lead has a clear read on the target's position. Then it closes. The federal case team told you this. Agent Mora told me this, she said, on Tuesday, after the man stood outside on Carroll's Street. Adrian turned onto Clement. 200 meters ahead, a motorcycle had stalled across the right lane, and the driver, Tate, unhelmeted, leaning over the engine with the convincing posture of someone having a genuine mechanical problem, was creating a bottleneck that had already produced a line of stopped traffic. Adrian pulled up behind the last stopped car and shifted into park. Get out, he said. Both of you, cross to the sidewalk. Walk north. There's a parking structure half a block up on the left. Go to the 3rd level, find a car against the north wall, and stay between the vehicles. Don't use your phones. Carol was already moving. Elena put her hand on the door handle and then stopped. Adrian. He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the stopped traffic, at Tate's bike, at the ordinary machinery of a street in the middle of a Thursday afternoon that had become the terrain of something else entirely. What are you going to do? I'm going to stay in the car, he said. Let them follow me. She turned to look at him. They're tracking the vehicle, he said. If you're not in it, they follow the vehicle. I lead them away. Reyes picks you up from the structure. They'll know, she said. When they close on the vehicle and you're alone, yes. That's not a plan, she said. That's a sacrifice. The word landed between them with the weight of something long overdue. He sat with it for a second. Then he said, I owe you one. Her eyes stayed on him, not softening. He wasn't asking for softening, wasn't looking for it, but something moving in them, something shifting in the specific way of a person revising an assessment in real time. Reyes has your number, Adrian said. He'll call from a clean phone, 3rd level, north wall. Elena opened the door and got out. Carol was already at the sidewalk. He watched them in the mirror. 2 women walking north on Clement Avenue, unhurried, the specific pace of people who know that hurrying draws eyes, until they turned into the mouth of the parking structure and were gone. He put the car in drive. He went straight through the intersection when Tate cleared the lane, watching the blue sedan in his mirror pick up speed behind him. 3 cars back. Then 2. The trail vehicle he couldn't see yet, but felt the way you feel things that are moving with intention, a pressure, a gravitational pull on the situation. He drove 6 blocks. He turned into the parking lot of a hardware store, large, open, multiple exits, the kind of space that was harder to control than a street. He parked near the center. He got out of the car. He stood next to it in the open, in the flat Thursday afternoon light, visible and still. The blue sedan pulled into the lot 30 seconds later. It parked 20 yards away. Two men got out. He didn't know them. Delgado sourced from outside the usual pools people who had no prior exposure to the organizational map, which was methodology rather than caution, but he knew the type. They were not unusual looking, that was the point. They walked toward him at a pace that was just this side of purposeful, the pace of men who were comfortable and had numbers. He watched them come. His phone rang. He let it ring. "Mr. Voss," the closer one said. He was perhaps 40, medium height, a gray jacket. He had the voice of someone who had rehearsed this. "Mr. Delgado would like—" "I know what Delgado wants," Adrian said. "Tell him the northern properties aren't a negotiation. Tell him the port arrangement is already inside a federal case, and transferring it creates liability he can't insulate himself from. Tell him he's made a miscalculation about what leverage he actually has." The man in the gray jacket looked at him. "Mr. Delgado expected you to say something like that." "Good," Adrian said. "Then he can add this. The testimony appendix he got from inside the federal case, the access point is flagged. The person who gave it to him has been cooperating with a secondary investigation for 6 weeks. He didn't buy information, he bought exposure. This was a fabrication. It was a precise and specific fabrication built from things he actually knew. The Corsair account monitor flag, the timeline of Sheila Park's approach, the general principle that federal investigations routinely ran secondary inquiries on information leaks, assembled into something that had the texture of truth. He had been doing this for 30 years. It was the one skill he still had complete confidence in. The man in the gray jacket said nothing. "Tell him," Adrian said, "that the woman is not available to him in any form. And tell him that the next contact between his people and mine happens through attorneys, or it doesn't happen in a way that's good for anyone." The second man, who had stayed back, which Adrian had noted and which told him the second man was the actual authority in this interaction, spoke for the first time. He had an older voice, measured. "You're in a difficult position to be making those kinds of statements, Mr. Voss." "I know," Adrian said. "I'm making them anyway." A pause. The two men exchanged something. Not words, just a look. The abbreviated communication of people who had worked together enough that full language was inefficient. Then the second man nodded, once, and they turned and walked back to the blue sedan and got in and left the lot. Adrian stood next to the car and breathed. His hands were not shaking. He checked them because he wanted to know, and they were not. He did not know whether this meant he was still who he had always been, or whether it meant the thing that caused hands to shake had already expended itself somewhere earlier and was no longer available for this moment. Either way, his hands were still. He called Reyes. "They're walking," he said. "Get to the structure." "On my way." "You all right?" "Get to the structure," Adrian said. He drove back to Clement. He parked on the street and walked into the parking structure on foot, and took the stairs to the third level and came out into the flat concrete light of a parking garage in the middle of the afternoon, and he found Elena and Carol between two parked cars against the north wall exactly where he'd told them to be. Carol saw him first. She let out a breath. Elena looked at him. She was holding the pen still. Same hand, same grip. She had been standing in a parking garage for 15 minutes with her pen in her hand, as though she'd stepped away from her desk for a moment and was planning to return. "They're gone," he said. "Reyes is coming. He'll take you to Hartman's, and we'll get the federal team back in position tonight." Elena nodded. He started to step back. Give her the space that was owed. That was the agreement. Carol's terms. The only terms available. He show up, he deliver the information, he stands back. "Adrian." He stopped. She was looking at him with the same expression from the car. Not softened, not warm, but alert, revised. The expression of someone who has seen something move that they had plotted as stationary. That was dangerous. What you did in the lot. It was manageable, he said. It was dangerous, she said again. And the repetition was not an argument, it was a statement. The specific statement of a woman marking that she had registered something and would not pretend otherwise. He stood with that. Then Reyes's car appeared at the top of the ramp, and Carol moved toward it. And Elena took 3 steps to follow her and then turned back one more time and looked at him across the width of the parking level, and she said, "Monday. Whatever happens Monday, I need you to know that I didn't do it to destroy you." "I know," he said. "I did it to survive," she said. I know that too, he said. And then, because it was true and because the situation had reached the specific threshold past which the only honest thing was the thing that cost the most, you should have had to. Something crossed her face, something that had been held for a long time and was not yet ready to be released but had moved, slightly, in the direction of movement. She got in Reyes's car. He stood in the parking structure and watched it go down the ramp and disappear. And he stood there until he could no longer hear the engine, and then he stood there a little longer. Monday was 3 days away. Between now and Monday, he had to call Hartman and rebuild what could be rebuilt of the legal position and decide which parts of the organizational structure could be surrendered cleanly versus which ones would require negotiation. He had to manage the Delgado situation through channels that didn't put anyone in a hardware store parking lot. He had to figure out what Nolan's cooperation had actually included and what could still be contained. He had to do all of these things. He stood in the parking structure and breathed, and for the first time in the days since the river, the breathing felt like something other than maintenance. It felt like the specific respiration of a man who still had something left. Not much, not the 30 years of accumulated structure that had given him certainty and territory and the illusion of unassailability, but something. He walked down the stairs. He walked out to the street. He stood on Clement Avenue in the flat afternoon light, and he called Hartman, and he said, "I need to come in, and I need to talk about what it looks like if I cooperate." Hartman was silent for 3 full seconds. Then, "Get here now." Adrian walked to the gray sedan. He got in. He started the engine. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, loose, the way they always were. The old habit of a man who had spent 30 years projecting certainty through the specific language of his hands. He drove. Hartman's office was on the 14th floor of a building that had been downtown since before Adrian was born. The kind of building that had outlasted 3 recessions and a complete reorganization of the city's financial district by virtue of being made of better material than what came after it. The elevator was slow, and the carpet in the hallway was dark green, and the receptionist had worked there for 19 years and knew Adrian by name without warmth, which was the only kind of knowing he'd ever required from her. He sat across from Hartman's desk at 4:15 on a Thursday afternoon, and he said, for the second time in his life, the first having been at age 23, in a different city, in a circumstance he had spent 30 years making irrelevant, the words that cost the most. "What does cooperation look like?" Hartman took off his glasses. He set them on the desk with the careful precision of a man performing a ritual he'd performed many times, the ritual of shifting from one kind of conversation to another. He looked at Adrian without the glasses in a way that was different, less mediated, more direct, the eyes of a 70-year-old man who had seen enough of other people's reckonings to have developed a comprehensive and unsentimental view of what they required. "It depends on what you give them," Hartman said, "and on what you're willing to accept in return." "Tell me the range." Hartman told him the range. It took 40 minutes. It covered the Northern Corridor properties, the Corsair accounts, the port arrangement, the Delgado Commission structure, the names of specific individuals who had operated inside the organizational framework and whose cooperation the federal case had not yet secured. It covered what Adrian had that the federal case wanted and what the federal case had that Adrian could not survive, and the narrow channel between those two bodies of information where negotiation was possible. It also covered, in the careful and indirect way that Hartman handled things he found personally difficult, the question of Elena. "Her immunity is comprehensive," Hartman said. "That doesn't change. Whatever you provide, whatever arrangement is reached, her agreement stands independently. I want to be clear about that." "I know," Adrian said. "You're not doing this to affect her situation." "No." Hartman looked at him. "Then why?" Adrian sat in the chair across from the desk and thought about the hardware store parking lot, about the blue sedan and the 2 men and the fabrication he had assembled from pieces of truth and delivered with the flat conviction of a man who still knew how to make things sound like facts. About the feeling, after the sedan left the lot, of standing in open asphalt in the afternoon light and finding that his hands were still. "Because it's the only thing left that I can do that isn't damage," he said. Hartman was quiet for a moment. Then he put his glasses back on. "All right," he said. "I'll make the call." The call happened that evening. Sheila Park came to Hartman's office at 7 p.m. with a colleague named Reeves who said very little and took very precise notes. And Adrian sat across the conference table from them and began the process of dismantling, in an organized and documented fashion, the thing he had spent 30 years building. It took 4 hours the first night. It took 3 more sessions over the following week. It was not clean. There were things Adrian knew that he had compartmentalized so thoroughly that recovering them required the specific and unpleasant work of retracing decisions he had made in contexts he would have preferred not to revisit. There were names he gave that cost him something he couldn't fully categorize. Not loyalty exactly, because the relationships in question were transactional rather than loyal, but something in the register of a life being taken apart at its foundations, and the dust that comes up when that happens. Delgado was arrested on a Wednesday, 11 days after the parking lot. The charges were federal, which meant they were serious, which meant the specific threat he had represented, to Elena, to the remaining structure of the organizational network, to the precarious legal arrangement Adrian was navigating, was removed with the thoroughness that federal charges applied to things they decided to be thorough about. Adrian heard about the arrest from Reyes, who heard about it from Tate, who heard about it from a scanner app on his phone. Adrian was sitting in the kitchen of the Callaway Street house eating toast when the call came. He put his phone down and finished the toast. The grand jury met. The charges that came down were significant and specific, covering the Northern Corridor properties and the Corsair accounts and the port arrangement, all documented with the architecture that Elena had built over 16 months. Adrian's cooperation agreement produced a modified charging structure that his attorney described as the best available outcome, and that Adrian understood as a precise and accurate accounting of what 30 years of certain kinds of decisions cost when the accounting was finally required. He would serve time. Not the maximum. Not nothing. Something in between, which was what the truth usually was. He did not fight it. Marcus Reyes sat across from him at the kitchen table on the morning Adrian was scheduled to surrender to federal custody, and they drank coffee together in the specific silence of 2 men who had spent 20 years in each other's company and understood that the language adequate to the moment didn't exist and had therefore agreed, without discussing it, to dispense with language. Eventually, Reyes said, "Nolan's in witness protection. Did you know that?" I figured. His daughter got to finish her degree. Reyes wrapped both hands around his cup. "I thought you should know that." Adrian looked at him. "You said to leave her out of it," Reyes said. "Back at the hospital, first morning, I wanted you to know I remembered that." Adrian nodded. They finished their coffee. Tate drove him to the federal building. He got out of the car alone, which was how he'd asked for it. No attorney theater, no management of the visual, just a man getting out of a car and walking through a door, which was what it was. The morning was cold and gray, and the street was ordinary. And he walked through the door, and the door closed behind him, and that was that. The morning after Adrian surrendered, Elena Marlowe sat at a table in a coffee shop 4 miles from Carol's house and opened her laptop and began, for the first time in 18 months, working on something that was not documentation or testimony or the careful organizational architecture of dismantling a life she needed to leave. She was writing, not for the federal case, not for an attorney, for herself, in the specific and private way that she had not allowed herself for years, because the time she had spent building the case had required a quality of attention that left room for very little else, and because before the case there had been the marriage, which had required a different quality of attention that had also left room for very little else. The coffee shop was small. The table was by the window. The street outside moved in the ordinary way of a Tuesday morning, people walking to work, a bus pulling away from a stop, the completely unremarkable life of a city going about its business. She had a large coffee and a notebook beside the laptop. She still thought better on paper for the first draft of anything, an old habit from a life before Adrian that she was now, with some deliberateness, recovering. She wrote for 2 hours. Carol appeared at 10 because Carol had taken to checking on her at irregular intervals in the casual, unconvincing way of someone trying to appear to be in the neighborhood, and Elena let her do this because it cost nothing to be checked on by someone who loved her, and the alternative, being somewhere Carol couldn't find her, had turned out recently to have its own complications. Carol sat down. She looked at the laptop screen and then away, because she understood that looking was not offered. She ordered a coffee and said, "How are you sleeping?" "Better," Elena said, which was true. The particular quality of sleeplessness she'd been carrying, the 4 hours a night, always partially awake, one ear toward the door sleeplessness of a person managing something that required constant vigilance, had begun to lift. Not completely, but the ceiling had risen. "The immunity agreement is finalized," Carol said. "Hartman's office confirmed yesterday." "I know," Maura called. A pause. Carol wrapped her hands around her cup. "And the charging documents?" "I've read them." "Elena." "Carol." Elena looked up from the laptop. "I know what you want to ask. And the answer is that I feel what I feel about it, which is complicated, and I'm not going to simplify it for the sake of giving you a clean answer." She paused. "I did what I had to do. He is accepting what comes from that. Those two things can both be true without either of them being a betrayal of the other." Carol looked at her for a moment. "That's very measured." "I've had time to measure it." "Are you measured about the parking garage?" Elena looked back at the laptop. "No," she said. "I'm not particularly measured about that." The parking garage had entered the specific category of things that she had thought she understood before they happened, and had understood differently after. She had known, in the abstract, that Adrian was capable of placing himself in front of something on behalf of another person. She had 14 years of evidence of his capacity for strategic self-sacrifice, for the kind of risk that served a larger architecture. She had told herself, on the third level of the parking structure, that what he'd done in the hardware store lot was strategic, that it was Adrian Voss doing what Adrian Voss did, which was manage situations and produce outcomes and maintain control through the careful deployment of whatever resource was currently available to him, including himself. She had been telling herself this for 11 days, and she had not entirely convinced herself. Not because she thought it wasn't true. It was probably true. It was probably all of those things. Strategic, calculated, the instinct of a man whose every move had always served a purpose. But she had stood in a parking garage and watched him walk toward two men in an open lot, alone, with no organizational backing, no leverage that she could see, and she had watched the way he stood, hands loose, feet apart, the specific stillness of a man who had simply decided to stop moving and let the thing come to him. And she had thought, despite everything, despite 14 years and 16 months, and a federal case built from the careful documentation of his failures, he's not managing this. He's paying for something. She did not know what to do with that. She was learning, at 51, that there were things that didn't require you to know what to do with them, that some things could simply exist in you, unresolved, neither forgiven nor unforgiven, neither the wound nor the healing, but the specific permanent scar that was neither one. She closed her laptop. She picked up her coffee. Outside, the bus stop filled and emptied and filled again, and the ordinary Tuesday morning continued without reference to her, which was exactly what she needed. 3 months passed. They passed the way months pass after a large and structural event, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular quality of time that has reorganized itself around a new set of facts and is simply proceeding according to those facts. Elena found an apartment on the west side of the city, the third floor of a building with good light, and a landlord who had not heard of Adrian Voss and had no particular reason to. She furnished it incrementally, the way you furnish a place when you are deliberately not trying to reproduce something that existed before, one piece at a time, chosen for itself rather than for its fit with anything else. She went back to work. Not to the organizational life of Adrian's world. She had never had a career inside that world, only adjacent to it, managing its social surface, and she had no interest in adjacent anymore. She went back to a version of the work she'd done before Adrian, which was financial analysis, which was the skill she'd had at 27 when she met him, and which turned out, somewhat to her own surprise, to still be there. She took a position with a firm that did not know her last name in its current context, and was unlikely to, because the firm was in a different city and operated in a sector that had no overlap with anything she was leaving behind. She told Carol about the position on a Sunday afternoon in Carol's kitchen, and Carol said nothing for a moment and then said, "Which city?" And Elena told her, and Carol said, How far? And Elena said, 4 hours. And Carol looked at the table and then back up and said, good. That's good. With the specific conviction of someone deciding to mean it. Sophie, Carol's daughter, said, can I visit? And Elena said yes, and that was the lightest thing that happened for a long time, and she held on to it. Vanessa Cole left the city before the federal proceedings concluded. She didn't call Adrian. She didn't call anyone connected to his world, which was a decision she had made in her apartment on the night of the accident, sitting on her couch in wet clothes with scotch in her hand, and had implemented with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent 17 months learning to move through a world shaped by someone else and had finally decided to move through her own. She went to her sister's, in a city she hadn't lived in since she was 22. She stayed for 2 weeks. Then she found an apartment. Then she found work. She was good at her work, had always been good at it, and the specific relief of being good at something that had nothing to do with Adrian Voss was larger than she had expected. She did not look at the news coverage of the federal proceedings. She was aware they were happening. She did not look. On the night the charging documents went public, she sat in her new apartment in her new city, and she thought about 4 words. You reached for me first. And she thought about what she had said them to mean, and what they had turned out to mean, and the distance between those two things. She did not cry. She had done her crying earlier, in private, in the car in the hospital parking lot, and in the shower the next morning, and in a specific and final session 3 weeks after the accident, when she had let herself feel the full weight of 17 months, and then closed the door on it. She was done crying about it. She was not done thinking about it. She suspected she would be thinking about it for a long time, not with grief exactly, but with the specific and instructive attentiveness that you bring to a mistake that taught you something genuinely important about yourself. She turned off the news. She went to bed. She slept well, which was the most honest evidence she had that she had made the right decision. Adrian's first letter to Elena arrived 4 months after he surrendered to federal custody. He had written it 6 times before sending it, not drafting and revising in the way of someone crafting a position, but writing and stopping and tearing up and starting again in the way of someone who keeps finding that what they're writing is not what they mean and has to keep going back to locate the actual thing. The final version was 3 paragraphs. He did not open with an apology, because he had decided that opening with an apology was a way of making the letter about his need to deliver one, rather than about what he actually wanted to say. He said, in the first paragraph, that he hoped the apartment had good light. He had known, somehow, that she would find an apartment, and that the light would matter to her, and saying so was a way of saying, I know you well enough to know this, which is a thing that remains true regardless of everything else. In the second paragraph, he said that he had been thinking about the river, not about what he had done in it. He had done enough thinking about that to have reached a resting place on the subject, which was not forgiveness of himself, and was not resolution, but was the specific stillness of a man who has looked at something until he understands its true dimensions and has stopped needing to measure it. He had been thinking, he wrote, about what she had said in the hospital. I know, 2 words. He said he had spent a long time thinking about what it meant that her first response to the most catastrophic moment of their shared life was not rage or grief, but knowledge. That she had been carrying the knowledge for so long that it had become simply another thing she carried, without drama, without the acute edge of a new wound. He said he was sorry for the weight of that. Not for the betrayal itself, though he was, and he said so plainly in 1 sentence, but for the duration. For the years she had spent carrying it before she could put it down. The third paragraph was short. He said he was not writing to ask for anything. He said he wanted her to know that the work she had done, the 16 months, the documentation, the architecture, was the most precise and courageous thing he had witnessed in 30 years of watching people do difficult things under pressure, and that he wanted her to hear that from him specifically, because he was the person best positioned to understand exactly what it had required. He did not sign it, love. He did not sign it sincerely. He wrote his name. Just his name, without the weight of the 30 years it had accumulated, stripped back to the 2 words that had existed before any of it. Adrian Voss. Elena received the letter on a Thursday, which was her day off. She read it at the kitchen table in the good light of her West Side apartment once, and then a second time more slowly. She put it down. She made more coffee. She picked it up again. She did not write back that day, or the next. She carried the letter the way she had carried many things, carefully, without drama, attending to it in the intervals between the other work of being alive. She wrote back 6 weeks later. Her letter was 2 paragraphs. The first said that the apartment had excellent light, east-facing. She had been right to want that. The second said that she had thought about what he wrote, about the weight of the years of carrying, and that she wanted him to know something in return. The weight had not been only grief. There had been, inside it, a clarity, the specific lucidity of a person who sees something truly and completely, that had made her capable of things she would not otherwise have been capable of. She said she was not grateful for the pain, but she was not unformed by it either. She was, on the other side of it, more precisely herself than she had been at any point in 14 years, and that was worth something, even if the cost was more than it should have been. She did not tell him what her new work was. She did not tell him which city. She told him the apartment had a small balcony where she sat in the evenings when the weather allowed, and that from the balcony she could see a park, and that there was a couple in the park who walked a very large dog every evening at 6:15 with the specific, unhurried regularity of people who had arranged their life around small, reliable pleasures, and that she found this unexpectedly sustaining. She signed it Elena. Just Elena. He received the letter on a Tuesday. He read it in the common room because that was where the mail was distributed, surrounded by the ordinary noise of a facility that processed people through difficult years with a certain institutional efficiency, and he read it with the noise around him and none of it reached him. He read it twice, and then he folded it and put it in the pocket of his shirt, against the left side of his chest, which was not a gesture he examined for meaning, but simply the thing his hands did, and then he sat for a while. The common room emptied gradually. The light through the high windows changed as the afternoon moved, going from flat white to the particular amber of late afternoon that was the same quality of light regardless of the building it fell through, the same light that fell through east-facing windows in a west side apartment 4 hours away, the same light that had once come through the windows of a house that no longer existed in any form that mattered. He sat in it. He was 53 years old, and he had built and lost an empire and driven a car into a river and reached for the wrong person in the dark, and gone back and been dismantled methodically by the woman he had dismantled first. And he was sitting in a room with the amber light coming through high windows, with his wife's letter in his shirt pocket, and he was not, in this moment, managing anything. He was not running a calculation, or constructing an architecture, or assessing vectors of damage and opportunity. He was simply sitting in a room at the end of an afternoon breathing, which was something he had apparently been doing incorrectly for 30 years, and was now, with the specific and unhurried attention of a man with time, learning to do right. He thought about Carver Creek, the way the water had taken the car, the way the cold had been a physical fact rather than a sensation, not something experienced, but something that simply was, the way walls are, the way the dark is. He thought about his hands finding Elena's coat in the dark water, the 6 seconds it took to get the window open, the way she had come without fighting and had let herself be pulled, and the way he had understood only later, much later, sitting in the amber light of a common room in a federal facility, that she had let herself be pulled not because she was helpless, but because she had decided to. Because she had weighed the options and chosen the one that kept her alive and available for the work she still had to do. She had been making decisions the whole time. He had been looking at her patience and seeing accommodation. He had been looking at her endurance and seeing permanence. He had been looking at a woman who was deciding and seeing a woman who was waiting, because waiting was the thing he expected and deciding was the thing he had never prepared for. He understood this now with the completeness of understanding that comes not from a single revelation, but from the accumulated weight of many mornings sitting with a thing until it becomes simply true, without drama, without the acute edge of discovery. He took the letter out of his pocket. He read the second paragraph again. More precisely herself than she had been at any point in 14 years. He thought about what it cost for that to be true. He thought about the couple in the park with the large dog, and the 6:15 regularity of them, and the fact that Elena found this sustaining. He thought about what it meant to be a person who had come through the particular fire of the last year and arrived at the other side still capable of being sustained by a couple with a dog in a park at 6:15. He thought it meant something important about her that he did not have the exact language for and did not need to have the language for. He folded the letter again. He put it back in his pocket. Outside, the light was going. In a West Side apartment 4 hours north, Elena Marlowe sat on her small balcony in the last of the evening and watched the couple in the park below complete their 6:15 circuit and turn back toward the park's eastern entrance. The dog, some kind of large, unhurried mixed breed with the disposition of a creature that had made peace with its circumstances, walked between them with the specific, plodding contentment of an animal whose needs were simple and reliably met. She had a cup of tea going cold in her hand. The park emptied. The couple disappeared through the eastern gate. The evening settled over the city in the slow democratic way of evenings, reaching everything equally, reshaping nothing, simply turning the light into something the eyes had to adjust to. She sat. She was not thinking about Adrian specifically. She was not thinking about the case, or the letter, or the 16 months, or the river. She was thinking about the work waiting on her laptop inside, a financial analysis she was halfway through and would finish tomorrow, which was a Wednesday. And on Wednesday evenings, the building super ran the trash compactor in the basement, and the sound came up through the floor in a way she had initially found disturbing and had, over months, come to find simply predictable, which was its own kind of comfort. She was thinking about the work and about Wednesday and about the predictability of the compactor, and the tea was cold in her hand and the park below was empty, and she took inventory of this in the careful, thorough way she took inventory of most things. She was all right, not repaired, not resolved, not the specific, complete wholeness of a person to whom nothing had happened, but all right in the way of someone who has located the dimensions of a thing she is carrying and has made arrangements that allow her to carry it without it carrying her. She went inside. She put the tea in the sink. She turned on the light in the kitchen, which was a warm light, not harsh, the kind of light she had chosen deliberately for exactly this room. She washed the cup, she dried it, she put it on the shelf. She opened her laptop. She worked. The city outside continued in its ordinary way, indifferent and constant, the ordinary infrastructure of an evening in a place that did not know or care about rivers or parking garages or letters or the specific and permanent cost of a single moment of hesitation in the dark. She worked until 10. Then she closed the laptop and went to bed and lay in the dark of a room that was hers, that smelled of nothing except what she had brought into it, that had a window through which, if she left the curtain open, she could see the stars on clear nights, and on cloudy nights could see the diffuse glow of the city spread across the underside of the clouds like a memory of light. She lay in the dark. She breathed. She slept.